Now close your eyes and imagine. You're preparing to spend the night alone at an abandoned campsite. But suddenly, you feel the presence of something approaching from the depths of the forest. What if that thing is watching you? Well, this is where the fear begins. If you want to hear more stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, like the video, and let's move on to the story immediately. Elena had been overwhelmed by the stress of her work and personal issues lately. She decided to go camping for a few days to clear her mind. Alone, she traveled for a few hours to a remote location, deep in nature, where she could fully escape. When she arrived at the campsite, the sky had already darkened. The forest was dense, and she found herself at an old. As she set up her camp, Elena noticed that the tents nearby had clearly not been used in a long time. With the temperature dropping and the sky darkening quickly, she began to feel a sense of unease, realizing that she was alone at the campsite. But was she truly afraid of being alone in the dark? After examining her surroundings and listening to the silence for a while, she couldn't calm herself. Still, she thought a few days alone here would be relaxing. She started a fire to spend the night and began watching the stars. It was then that something felt off. She heard a sound coming from the depths of the forest. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but when the sound stopped, she hesitated for a moment. She quickly checked the fire and looked around. Fortunately, there was nothing there. But the sound came again. A faint, trembling rustle. Elena narrowed her eyes and listened carefully. The sound was coming from deep within the forest, but it was far away. Was it an animal, or just the wind? She couldn't tell. But then, she realized, it sounded like a person screaming in agony. A chill ran down her spine. A few minutes later, the noises stopped. Feeling uneasy, she decided to lie down, but she couldn't sleep. Something was wrong with her tent. Everything was silent, yet something had visibly changed. A shadow appeared inside the tent, but there was no wind, nothing had moved. Creepy, isn't it? Elena's heart began to race. The cold air sent chills deep into her bones. She took a step outside the tent, but the forest around her was completely silent. At that moment, a whisper echoed right beside her ear. "Find me! Find me!" Elena's body felt paralyzed. When she turned her head, she noticed an old stone at the corner of her tent, with a note placed on top, "I will stay here forever." Frozen with fear, she picked up the note and read the words over and over again. But suddenly, something moved in the darkness of the forest ahead. What was that? She saw a figure emerging from the depths of the forest. It looked human, yet its feet didn't touch the ground. It moved slowly toward her, and with each step, the darkness thickened. The air grew colder, heavier, suffocating. "Find me," the figure whispered, drawing closer with every step. Elena let out a scream and stumbled backward, but something was following her. With every step she took, the figure became clearer. Its face was old and faded, its eyes completely absent. Only empty, white, blind sockets remained. She stopped for a moment. "What do you want from me?" she screamed. The figure halted, then slowly moved closer and, in a trembling voice, whispered, "I will take your place." At that moment, Elena turned and ran, but no matter how fast she moved, the entity was always one step ahead. She rushed toward her tent, only to find that the entrance was gone. In its place stood a massive stone. Panicked, she circled the stone, searching for a way out. But suddenly, an unbearable cold seeped into her bones. The entity was now unbearably close. Even without eyes, she could feel it perceiving her, as if her very existence echoed within its ghostly presence. Then, before she could react, the figure appeared directly in front of her. A chilling breath washed over her, making her shudder as she collapsed to the ground. The figure looked down at her one last time, its trembling fingers reaching toward her. "Find me. It's your turn now," it whispered, as its hands closed over Elena's face. At that moment, when Elena closed her eyes, something completely unexpected happened. She suddenly opened them again, only to find herself sitting on the very stone where the note had been. The world around her blurred and began to fade away. For a brief moment, she thought everything had been just a nightmare. But then, she realized. Slowly, she moved her fingers, feeling something pulling her inward. The entity had become a part of her. And in that instant, Elena was lost within the forest, no longer herself, but another wandering soul, another forgotten presence. Jake decided to head to a deserted campsite deep in nature. He was longing for the peace of the outdoors and wanted to escape the city. While browsing old photos online, he found that the campsite had been abandoned years ago. However, this abandonment only intrigued him more. The silence and solitude promised the tranquility Jake was searching for. When Jake arrived at the campsite, everything was eerily silent. No one was around, only old trees and faded trails. He walked toward the center of the camp, and after a long trek, he finally reached the heart of the site. That first night, after lighting a fire, Jake fell into a deep sleep. However, in the early hours of the morning, he woke up to a strange sound. A melodic tone echoed from a distance, a soft, haunting tune, as if a flute was playing. But there were no human voices coming from the depths of the forest, nor from any nearby area. Intrigued, Jake left his tent and followed the sound. Would you have walked down this path? The source of the sound seemed to be coming from a stone structure at the farthest corner of the deserted camp. Jake guessed it was an old shed or garage, but the strange thing was, the building appeared to be locked. After a short while, the melodic sound suddenly stopped. Jake, feeling compelled, decided to force the door open. When he stepped inside, what he saw shook him to his core. The room was covered in old photographs. However, these photos didn't reflect any history of the abandoned campsite Jake had seen in the past. The images were of smiling groups of people, but none of them were familiar faces. What was most disturbing was the text written under each photograph: "The next one is waiting for you." For a moment, Jake felt a growing unease. He wanted to quickly leave the room, but suddenly, a dark shadow emerged from the corner. As the shadow became clearer, Jake couldn't believe his eyes. Slowly, the shadow took form, moving toward the center of the room. It then stopped and, looking directly into Jake's eyes, whispered just one word: "Time." In that instant, Jake's world crumbled. Time was something that flowed, moving everything quickly forward, but this was different. Jake's body seemed to freeze in that very moment. Along with time, the space around him began to change. The shadow vanished before his eyes, but everything else was transforming. The once deserted camp now appeared much older, decaying, and in ruins. Jake suddenly felt the urgency to find the tent he had left behind. But something was wrong. Time didn't seem to move. No matter how many steps he took, he kept seeing the same trees, the same old stones, the same empty spaces. No matter how far he walked, he couldn't leave the campsite. That moment shattered his mind. The camp wasn't just abandoned, it was a trap for time. People had come here, gotten lost, and were now trapped in this very moment forever. No matter how hard Jake tried to escape, he eventually realized that time itself had become his prison. Everything was cyclical, always returning to the same place. From that day forward, only one being remained in the deserted camp: Jake, but he was now a figure existing in different times. He was lost within time, yet he had never truly disappeared. Lucas, while browsing the internet, stumbled upon an abandoned campsite deep within a dense forest. It had been years since anyone had set foot in this place, and it promised the perfect solitude Lucas was craving. This was the ideal spot for him to discover how deeply nature could offer peace. Upon arriving at the campsite, he began exploring. As he ventured further, he observed the dilapidated bungalows and decaying paths, now darkened by time. Yet, strangely, despite everything being in disrepair, there was an undeniable energy in the air. Lucas was determined to uncover the source of this feeling. After preparing his dinner, he decided to spend the night around the fire. The sky had fully darkened, and the surrounding silence seemed to suggest that something was waiting. As time passed, Lucas began to feel something unusual. The shadows around the fire started to move. For a brief moment, he felt as though he were being watched. Before he could focus, he heard a sound, a distant cry, almost like a wail. He tried to listen closely, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to concentrate. The shadows grew more distinct, and soon Lucas could feel the overwhelming sensation of fear wrapping around him. He decided to head back to his tent. But when he reached the entrance, he noticed the door was open. He rushed inside, only to find that something was inside. There, on the table, was an ancient manuscript. Lucas examined the book carefully, at first not understanding its significance, but it quickly began to captivate him. The pages looked like old writings, some pages missing, but a few remained legible. The book contained only one word: time. As he continued to examine the book, a sound came from outside the tent again. This time, it was much closer, but even more peculiar. Lucas quickly shut the door and returned his attention to the book. It described how time had stopped, how it had been cut off, and how people had disappeared into this very campsite, trapped in time. He didn't fully understand, but a gnawing unease began to creep into him. Suddenly, Lucas realized the true nature of what was happening. At that very moment, he felt something shift, as though a door had opened. Outside, everything seemed to begin moving. The trees swayed in the wind, but Lucas remained motionless. Everything around him was changing rapidly. It was as if time had vanished in an instant, trapping him in a place where it didn't exist. The campsite had become a kind of threshold, a place where people came, only to be lost to time. Lucas, no matter how far he walked, kept seeing the same path, the same trees, the same stones, over and over again. Time seemed to offer him only a loop, a place where everything remained static. No matter how much he moved, nothing changed. At that moment, he understood the meaning behind the book's words. Those who stayed here were trapped in time, a never-ending cycle where past, present, and future all blended together. Lucas had found himself lost in an endless labyrinth with no way out. Eventually, the campsite fell silent once more. Only the echoes of time remained. Lucas had disappeared, but neither time nor place would ever truly be known again. The campsite was a trap of time, and Lucas, leaving only a trace, was lost within it forever.